Well, now we have to spend a couple of weeks talking about the cuddly, loving, twinkly eyed governor of Minnesota, Tim Waltz. And so I want you to have the facts. We always bring the receipts here at Salem News Channel. And so, in that vein, let's first see how he was able to or unable to actually garner more votes for Democrats in the state of Minnesota in his victory in the governor's race back in 2022. NBC's Steve Kornacki actually goes through a lot of detail here. Take a look.
Look at this. In 2012, Barack Obama won 43% of the vote in this county. It was only a little bit more than 10 points that he lost to Romney by here. The floor fell out for Democrats here when Trump came along in that Clinton race in 2016, and they haven't recovered it since. In that Walz performance here, it's a little less than Biden's number. It's more than Clinton's, and it's a far cry from what Obama was doing here. And again, I'm showing you one. This is a stand-in for dozens of counties in Minnesota where you saw the same thing with large rural populations, blue-collar white populations, where Obama, and some of them he was winning, others he was holding his own just a dozen years ago. This is where Democrats have lost ground. In Walz in 2022, he didn't gain any ground that the Democrats had lost. He didn't do that here. He didn't do that in other counties. Walz really owes his victory, that that margin he got 8 points there statewide. He owes it to the Twin Cities area here, the area where Democrats in Minnesota and all these other states are already doing well. It's sort of it's the standard Democratic victory model in a state like this. It got Walz in 2022. This is the biggest county in the state. This is where Minneapolis is. Hennepin County. Walz wins this by 44 points. Look at all the votes that came out of their total. It's huge. And again, that's right in line with what Joe Biden did in 2020 when he won Minnesota. And again, just wind the clock back here. 12 years ago, this was still a blue county, but less blue. So it's the suburban areas, the metropolitan areas that have gotten much more blue. And Walz performed just like Biden did, better than Clinton did in places like this. And then in the rest of greater Minnesota, small town Minnesota, where the Democrats have been losing ground, Walz performed basically just like Biden did as well. So, look at his electoral history. Tim Walz is in 2022, and the idea that he's got this automatic appeal with these small town areas in those three key battleground states, you don't see it in what he actually did on the ballot in 2022.
Yeah, so this is not a small town appeal guy. He's someone who actually said that socialism is being neighborly. He actually compares socialism to being a neighborly person. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. Socialism results in gulags, death, and a progression into communism, which killed hundreds of millions of people in the last century, the century I'm from. And so I think it's really important that whenever someone holds these views, we highlight them. So let's get a little further into this. Don't take my word for it. Van Jones is an openly liberal progressive. He's hard on the left. He has views that are such. He shares those views prominently. He's an analyst and commentator on all of the channels. He gets interviewed routinely. He's actually thought of as, on the left, a thought leader. And so he was talking about the reason for Waltz as the pick, as opposed to a Josh Shapiro. Now, Josh Shapiro is another big state governor. He's a swing state governor of the state of Pennsylvania. He recently was elected, and it was a big upset there in that gubernatorial race because word on the street was, we brought receipts on that too, that you had a senator from Kentucky, Senator McConnell, actually raising money for him as opposed to the Republican candidate. Now, regardless of whether or not we had defections in that area, the fact is Josh Shapiro is seen as the future of the Democrat Party. He's someone who is moderate in some ways. He's very attractive, great speaker. He governs his state well. People there have great approval ratings for him in the polls. And so he was seen as a natural choice. Now, obviously, we have to acknowledge that some leaders, some people who have great futures in the Democrat Party are not going to want to hitch themselves to a 90-day presidential ticket that was cobbled together after the failure of the candidate at the top. That's not an attractive way to run for the president. It doesn't give you any time to get your messaging out there for people to truly get to know you outside of this ridiculous marketing campaign. And so with that in mind, Josh Shapiro was still in the running, but was he really? We'll never know the backstory on that unless he decides to write a book about it. But here's Van Jones giving his opinion on why Shapiro was not the pick instead of the radical Governor Waltz.
Hey, listen, the conservatives, the right wing, the Republicans, they were chewing their fingernails down to the knuckle because they were afraid of a Josh Shapiro. They were afraid of a Mark Kelly. They're not as afraid of this new governor because they think they can define him. So here's the challenge you've got in this party. And people don't want to talk about it. We got to talk about it. On the one hand, you have a lot of young people who are concerned about Gaza. You have a lot of Muslims and Arabs and others. They have not felt seen by the Biden administration. You start hearing that genocide joke. That was building. And so those folks needed to have a candidate that they could feel comfortable with. This helps them in that regard. But you also have anti-Semitism that has gotten marbled into this party. You can be for the Palestinians without being an anti-Jewish bigot, but there are some anti-Jewish bigots out there. And there's some disquiet now, and there has to be. How much of what just happened is caving into some of these darker parts in the party?
Now, I have to give Van Jones credit here, and I actually find myself doing that more and more often. Not that I agree with his ideology, but he's pointing out something that's an inconvenient truth for the Democrats. There are huge protests going on right now supporting a terrorist who was killed. I mean, this is a person who killed people, brutally tortured them, and sent out terrorists on terror bombing attacks and all kinds of things. We're talking about someone who is one of the worst human beings on the planet. He was killed in a drone strike, and there are people here in this country who are holding up his picture as if something terrible happened. Usually when criminals are snuffed out, the land rejoices. It's actually biblical. A cry and a shout of joy will go up in the land when someone who hurts people is taken out. People see that as retributive justice. They see it as God's hand at work, bringing sanity back into their lives. I'm certain that the people who are victims, people whose family have been killed by this man and his terrorism, are rejoicing today, knowing that a drone strike took him out and he can hurt no one else. But in America, we have people who are actually holding him up and saying, we're so sorry he was killed, and how dare you kill this man? So think about that. These people who are doing this protesting on behalf of a terrorist, they're Democrats. So when Van Jones says that anti-Semitism has been marbled into the Democrat Party, he's not lying about it. He's using, I think it's a baker's term there, but it appropriately describes the full incorporation from one thing into another in such a way that it cannot be extracted. How do you extract the anti-Semites from the Democrat Party? Well, you'd have to have a national movement to stop it. You'd have to have a bunch of people with power, money, and influence, people with public personas, stand up and say in unison, kind of like the We Are the World song that they created back in the 80s, they have to stand up and say, we don't tolerate anti-Semitism. And they're not going to do that because they see it as a new burgeoning part of their coalition, a base they're going to have to answer to, which means Jewish people will necessarily have to remove themselves from that party if they want to have the right to live and be a fully functioning member of our society. And that's what we're looking at. In spite of Ali Pac's efforts, last night they ousted Cori Bush here in the state of Missouri. She's a squad member, so that was a victory, but it won't actually make a difference in the long run because it's marbled in, as Van Jones said. Up next, an IDF commander announces the death of a terrorist commander by drone strike. I'll tell you who, what, where, when, and how right after this.